Hello and welcome into another episode of Locked On Wolves. Today on the show, are the Timberwolves actually better without Karl-Anthony Towns, especially on offense? What about defense? Overall, what does Cat bring to the table the Wolves are missing now? The Wolves are 8-4 since the injury. Let's dive into the numbers and see which side of the narrative we should land on here related to Cat. Also, the Houston Rockets game tonight. We'll preview that matchup. It's all upcoming. Welcome in. You are Locked On Wolves.
You are Locked On Timberwolves, your daily Minnesota Timberwolves podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
Hello and welcome to the Locked On Wolves podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. My name is Ben Beecken. I'm the host of Locked On Wolves. Today's episode is brought to you by Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use the code LOCKEDONNBA for $20 off your first purchase. Happy Tuesday, everybody. Happy game day. The Wolves take on the Houston Rockets tonight for the third and final time in the regular season series between the two teams. We'll preview that towards the end of the show, but today I want to talk about the hot button issue of the Timberwolves with and without Karl-Anthony Towns. We have to have the conversation, as much as I hate the whole hot takiness of, like we're talking about a 12-game sample since the injury, right? Still, it's important to evaluate, especially as the Wolves start to think about reintegrating Karl-Anthony Towns. He should likely be reevaluated in the next couple of weeks here, and especially following that Denver win on Friday night. There was some clamoring about, hey, are the Wolves better without Cat? And then after the loss on Sunday to Chicago, the other side of the argument had their field day on Twitter of, well, guess what? Turns out you need Karl-Anthony Towns shooting and his scoring. I want to talk about both sides of this and how we can have a reasonable conversation about the Timberwolves with Karl-Anthony Towns and the Timberwolves without Karl-Anthony Towns. Which version is better and why? That's what we'll do today on the show. First of all, though, off the top, a big thank you for making Locked On Wolves your first listen every day. Of course, this show is free and available everywhere. That includes YouTube as well as all of your favorite audio platforms. Wherever you like to listen to podcasts, you can find Locked On Wolves. You can also watch on the Locked On Sports Minnesota app on both Roku and Amazon Fire TV. And you can follow on X at Locked On T Wolves and also at Beecken with two B's, two E's, CKEN. Also, a reminder about the postcast. Not only do I cover your team every day right here on the Locked On Wolves feed Monday through Friday, but we also give you instant episodes after every single game. Check out the Locked On Wolves postcast right here on the Locked On Wolves podcast feed, as well as streaming on the Locked On Sports Minnesota YouTube channel. Get rapid reaction to all the biggest moments with the Locked On Wolves postcast. Again, live on YouTube after the games on Locked On Sports Minnesota, and then also the audio here on the Locked On Wolves audio feed as well. All right. So here's the thing. Objectively, there's almost no way that you could look at the Timberwolves and say, hey, we're going to remove a guy from the team who's their best three-point shooter, who's shooting, 42+% from three, averaging 22 and 8, and has probably had the best defensive, has had the best defensive season of his career in his prime. Remove him for an all-star, remove him from the team, and they're better, right? Objectively, that doesn't make any sense. And I've said as much kind of in passing on the show. So that's kind of where I'm coming from. However, the flip side of it is this team has been 8-4 without him. Anthony Edwards is playmaking like we've never really seen. And I don't know that we'd call 12 games an extended period of time, but this is a stretch of playmaking and decision-making from Ant while his usage has increased, that until the last couple of games when he's seen the three-point shooting not go well for him. He's dropped well below 37%. He's just a shade over 36% for the year now. But overall, we've seen his play get better while the usage has increased. And we haven't seen a significant dip defensively. So there's also that side of it. And they beat Denver along the way. They take Denver to overtime on a back-to-back in another game. They beat the Clippers. Like, there's some nice wins in there post Karl-Anthony Towns knee injury. As always, the truth is somewhere in the middle, but I'm not just going to say I don't know. Like, I'm going to come to a conclusion here based on what we have so far as evidence with and without Karl-Anthony Towns. I will take a stand on this. So let's start here. the overall offensive rating pre-Karl-Anthony Towns injury and post-Karl-Anthony Towns injury. Let's look at that. And also we can look at the season for that matter too. So before the Karl-Anthony Towns injury, the Timberwolves offensive rating, this is through March 6th, which is prior to that Pacers game, the one where Ant hit his head on the rim and the Wolves won late against the Pacers. Before the Karl-Anthony Towns injury, the Timberwolves were 17th in offensive rating league-wide, 116.3 offensive rating. After the Karl-Anthony Towns injury, oh, and I should say that's over the course of what is that, 52 games? No, 62 games. Okay. After the Karl-Anthony Towns injury, so the last 12 games, the Timberwolves are 15th in offensive rating, 116.1. So in terms of their league-wide ranking, they've gone down 2 slots. In terms of their offensive rating, just like straight up rating, they're 0.2 points worse. Okay. So basically they're the same because the rating is slightly worse. Their league ranking is slightly better. Basically the same in terms of just general offensive rating since Karl-Anthony Towns got hurt. And for the season, the overall mark is, of course, right there as well, right? Because it's been roughly the same. How have they gotten there, though? Because that looks a little bit different. Have they shot more threes to try and compensate, which is, was part of what I thought they should do, even though Towns is their best three-point shooter? No, they've actually been almost exactly the same. Their three-point rate has been basically the same with and without Karl-Anthony Towns. Okay, pre-Karl-Anthony Towns injury, the Wolves were 19th in the league in three-point rate. 34.3% of their field goals were coming from outside the arc. Since the Karl-Anthony Towns injury, they're 20th. 34.8% are coming from outside the arc. So 0.5% more of their shots are coming from outside the arc, and they're 20th ranked instead of 19th ranked. So basically the exact same over the last 12 games as they were over the first, 62, 63 games. No change. They have, however, played faster, which is the second thing that I thought the Wolves should do sans Karl-Anthony Towns. I thought they should shoot more threes, and I thought they should increase their pace. They are indeed playing faster. Okay, so if you look, and by the way, I should have said, I'm pulling this all from Cleaning the Glass, which is often where I pull this stuff from. But I'm pulling it from Cleaning the Glass. So if you look at overall pace since the Karl-Anthony Towns injury, so for the season, the Wolves are 29th in pace or frequency of transition, according to Cleaning the Glass. And you could look at Basketball Reference, and for the season, they're actually up to 24th in pace. But remember, Cleaning the Glass takes out garbage time, takes out heaves at the end of quarters. So for the season, they're 29th in pace at Cleaning the Glass. Since the Towns injury, they're actually 23rd. And they've incrementally increased the amount of time that they're running in transition. For the season, and we've talked about this before, despite being 29th in pace, they're first in transition efficiency, first in points per 100 plays in transition. Since the Towns injury, they're second. So they've increased their frequency, and their efficiency has not really dipped at all. They're running successfully after steals, less so, more middle of the pack off of defensive rebounds, okay? So they've improved their pace. The three-point shooting is about the same. What's one area that they've been lacking in since the Karl-Anthony Towns injury? Well, free throw shooting. Their free throw rate has gone down as a team since Cat's injury. And that's it shouldn't be surprising. Well, there's two reasons for that. One is directly related to Karl-Anthony Towns because Cat is one of the best on the team in terms of drawing fouls. And we'll talk a little bit more about that here in a minute. And I'll give some, I think everyone knows that, but Cat is really good at getting to the free throw line. Since the beginning of the season, the Timberwolves are this includes the post-Cat injury. The Wolves are 8th in the league in free throw rate, according to Cleaning the Glass. So they attempt 21 free throws per 100 field goal attempts. Okay. That's since the beginning of the season. If we look at since the Karl-Anthony Towns injury, the Timberwolves drop all the way to 24th in the league, just 15.2 free throws per 100 field goal attempts. So basically 6 less free throws per 100 field goal attempts, which is, that's like 3 or 4 per game since the Karl-Anthony Towns injury. In addition to the Cat injury, though, what else happened? There was the Rudy Gobert money sign thing that happened in game 2 without Karl-Anthony Towns. That was the Cleveland game that followed the Pacers game, which which was the first game after the cat injury. We talked about this on a show the other day. I'm not saying that there's a direct link, but there could be a direct link. I think that was Friday's show we talked about this. So those are two pretty important things that have happened over the last 12 games. And the Timberwolves' offensive free throw rate has gone down dramatically. Okay, I want to put a bow on the conversation here next and take my stand. Now that we've kind of laid out, the offense is basically the same. They've just gone about it a little bit differently, right? They're playing faster. They're getting to the line less, though. So more possessions, roughly the same three-point rate, three-point efficiency, but they do get to the line less frequently without Karl-Anthony Towns. What does that mean in terms of the overall flow of the game? Because there's also the ball movement thing, right? Because anecdotally, we look at this and say, oh, well, the ball sticks with Karl-Anthony Towns on the floor. They're sharing the ball so much more now. Is that true? We'll dive into those numbers here next. Today's episode of Locked On Wolves is brought to us by our friends at BetterHelp. The show is sponsored by BetterHelp. Sometimes we all need the opportunity to get something off our chest, big or small. Certain things can really start to get to you. It's important to let that out, especially to someone who's unbiased on your life. Today, I want to say how I really feel about something. You might even be thinking about the same thing this week, and it is Chris Finch's, and we talked about this a few weeks ago, he's not getting enough love for Coach of the Year. And I talked a little bit about this on the Locked On NBA show on Monday with Jackson Gatlin. He asked me to make the case for Chris Finch's Coach of the Year. And it seems like Mark Daigneault is probably going to win it, especially if the OKC finishes first in the West. But, I mean, Mark Daigneault has SGA. Shai Gilgeous-Alexander is pretty unequivocally one of the best 5 or 6 players in the entire league. Nobody's arguing that Ant is currently a top 10 player in the league. No one's arguing Cat's a top 10 player in the league. And the rest of this roster is effectively the same as it was last year. But Chris Finch has found a way to integrate Rudy plus Karl-Anthony Towns and help Ant continue to grow. He's kind of shepherded this whole thing, right? Like Chris Finch is at the helm of this thing. His laid back, yet also tough love and direct approach has been really successful this season. And he's just not getting enough love at the national level. And he coached the All-Star team and everything. Nobody's really talking about it. And look, I get it. This is fairly trivial. Many of us have bigger problems than, the disrespect of our favorite sports team's head coach on the national level. But hey, it's important to get things off your chest every once in a while. And yeah, therapy can look different for everyone. If you're thinking of starting therapy, give BetterHelp a try. It's entirely online, designed to be flexible and suited to your schedule. Visit BetterHelp.com/LockedOnNBA to get 10% off your first month. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com/LockedOnNBA. Do you watch Fox Sports or ESPN in your TV all day long? And if you do you have to turn down the volume with all the shouting? I'm sure that you do, because whenever I have it on, I do the same. But hey, instead, make the switch to Locked On Sports today, a free 24/7 sports streaming channel program for you every day to bring you the biggest stories without all the screaming. Locked On Sports today brings you can't-miss analysis, opinions, and news streaming 24/7 on YouTube or the free Amazon Fire TV channels app, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. All right. So we've established that the Timberwolves offense is effectively the same in the 12 games after the Karl-Anthony Towns injury compared to the 60-plus games with Karl-Anthony Towns. He missed a couple games here and there, yes, but I'm using the body of work for the Wolves, which is much larger, obviously, before the Towns injury to the 12 games after. Okay? They're playing a little faster. The offense is about the same in terms of efficiency. They're shooting less free throws, but the three-point rate is effectively the same. There's two other things that are really important. One is that are important to point out, I should say. The turnovers have gone down since the Karl-Anthony Towns injury. Part of that is Ant's usage has gone up. And yes, he had like 6 turnovers the other night. And in general, the turnover rate's going to go up a little for Ant just because he's got the ball in his hands so much more often. But he's also attempting to shoot a lot more often. And instead of 2 high usage guys that are trying to like walk this line between creating for themselves and for others in Anthony Edwards and Karl-Anthony Towns, there's only one of those guys now. So, of course, you're going to see overall turnovers go down for this team. And the turnover rate since the Karl-Anthony Towns injury for Minnesota has plummeted. They're actually 4th best in the league in the last 12 games in offensive turnover rate. Only 11.7% of their offensive possessions are ending in a turnover. That's crazy compared to where we were earlier this season. For the year, so this includes, of course, the last 12 games, Minnesota's turnover rate is still all the way down at 23rd, 14.4% for the season. That's how good they've been since the Karl-Anthony Towns injury in terms of avoiding turnovers. And I'm going to pull up, I guess just specifically pre-Karl-Anthony Towns injury, so I have that exact number with how bad they were, but they were bottom 5 in the league. I know that. That exact number was 25th, 14.9% of the time. So they were 25th in the league in turnover rate before the Cat injury. They're 4th in the 12 games since. So on the plus side of the no Cat offense, they turn it over far less, and they're playing a little bit faster. On the negative side, they're missing their best three-point shooter, although the rate and efficiency is roughly the same, and they're also getting to the line a lot less. The one other thing I want to point out that would be on the side of making the case for why Karl-Anthony Towns is not detrimental, which is a weird way to say that, but you know what I mean. Why he's not detrimental to the Wolves offense. Well, before the Karl-Anthony Towns injury, the Timberwolves were 8th in the league in passes per game as a team, which is not like the end-all be-all for sharing the basketball, but NBA.com advanced stats tracks passes per game. The Wolves were 8th in the league in passes per game at 291. Since the Towns injury, they're 9th in the league at 292 passes per game. So almost exactly the same, within one pass per game. So they're not passing the ball more without Karl-Anthony Towns. Anecdotally, the ball movement seems better, and yes, the turnovers are down, but the numbers don't necessarily back that up. So what is my opinion on this? What is my take on if the Wolves are better or worse without Karl-Anthony Towns? I don't think they're certainly not better without Karl-Anthony Towns. Are there things they've improved in his absence? Yes. I do think, well, the number of passes per game are the same, effectively. It has unlocked a little bit more from Anthony Edwards because more has been required of him. And I think in the long run, that's going to be a beneficial thing for Minnesota. I think it'd be silly to try and argue with a straight face that this team is a better offense without Karl-Anthony Towns. And, case in point, you could say the Bulls game, right? Now, the Wolves still generated good looks in that game. They just missed them. And that could happen with Karl-Anthony Towns on the floor too. But to say the Wolves could be better without their best three-point shooter and their most efficient, albeit turnover prone, but efficient offensive player, and a guy who gets the light a bunch, which obviously is a big part of efficiency, that would be silly to try and argue that. I also think, where I don't want to focus too much on defense today, but I think he's important to the Wolves, what they do defensively, just from a size perspective and his role and the aggressiveness he's played with defensively. 2 out of the last 3 years, last year, the injury kind of messed with Towns, obviously, and messed with the Wolves. But 2 years ago, in a different defensive scheme under Chris Finch, Cat was effective defensively. It was his best defensive season to that point. This year's supersedes that in a different scheme. Cat's flexibility, his size, and weirdly enough, well, not weirdly enough, his adaptability, his ability to play in different schemes, especially defensively, has been huge this year. And I think he's important to what they do on defense. And the defense has still been good since the Cat injury, but it's just been thinner. Right? Like Luka Garza Naz Reid can approximate what Karl-Anthony Towns does, right? Luka Garza can't really, right? If Naz is a high percentage of what Cat can do, 75, 80% of what Cat is, Garza is somewhere below 50%, right? Like, yeah, he can stretch the floor. Yeah, he can rebound, but he's not switchable defensively. You can't just do anything with him defensively like you can really with Cat and with Naz and even with Rudy. In terms of a flexibility standpoint. So Cat's big body is super important defensively, and he's bought in. I think he also makes the offense better. And perhaps the most important thing is the ceiling of the Timberwolves with Karl-Anthony Towns is much, much, much higher. Can the Wolves win the first round without Karl-Anthony Towns? Absolutely they can. I do think they can. Sitting here right now, they'd be playing, sitting here right now, they'd be playing the Pelicans in the first round. I don't love that. But I mean, they could be playing the Pelicans. It could face Dallas. It could be Phoenix. It could be Sacramento. There's like 5 or 6 possible opponents for Minnesota. No matter who it is, they can beat them, especially with home court advantage without Karl-Anthony Towns. Will it be tougher? I do think it will be. Can they win more than one round without Karl-Anthony Towns? I don't know about that. I don't think they can win the title without Karl-Anthony Towns. And therefore, I can't argue with a straight face that this is a better team without Karl-Anthony Towns. And I don't think anyone should. Now, if we start to talk about asset management and salary cap and how much money he makes and how expensive this team is with the money owed to Ant and to Rudy and to Jaden and to, well, I guess now Conley as well, and to Nas. When you start talking about that, that's an offseason conversation. Karl-Anthony Towns absolutely might be traded this offseason. That's an offseason conversation. But I would never argue that the Wolves are better off now or a better offense now or will go farther in the playoffs without Karl-Anthony Towns. They can win in the first round without him, and they might need to. I don't know that they can win in the second round. I'm pretty convinced they can't win a title without Karl-Anthony Towns on the floor and functioning at a, something reasonably close to an all-star level for this team. It's going to be super important come playoff time. The ceiling of this team, the sky, even though we never really saw it pre-Cat injury, the offense was never a well-oiled machine. The potential for it to get there, and also the one, Cat 37.63 game, which you might get in the playoffs. I mean, people remember the bad ones. They remember the play-in game last year against LA, right? Like, people remember the bad Cat games, the bad moments. He's had some good ones in the playoffs, too. He had some good games against Denver last year. And he might win them a game in the second round by just getting hot. Karl-Anthony Towns is vital to the Wolves' playoff success this year. We can have a conversation about whether he's worth more with this team in the luxury tax next year or whether trading him and acquiring assets and some cap flexibility back is ultimately the better move for Minnesota. That's a conversation for after the Wolves are done playing in the playoffs, which hopefully is a long time from now. Hopefully it's 2+ months, 2.5 months from now. It would be a best case scenario. All right. Let's close the show here today by talking Wolves-Rockets. We'll do that here next. Today's episode of Locked On Wolves is brought to us by our friends at Game Time. Game Time is now an authorized ticket marketplace of Major League Baseball. It makes getting tickets even faster and easier. Prices on the Game Time app actually go down the closer it gets to the first pitch. I'll tell you what, baseball tickets can be tricky, especially this time of year. Everyone's excited to get back into the ballpark, and there's a lot of fun teams to watch this year, depending on where you live. Obviously, the Dodgers are exciting. They loaded up. They have Ohtani, etc. The Rangers winning the World Series, so there's people, in that area in Oklahoma, Texas, people around here that are super excited about the Rangers. And getting the best tickets, the best games can be really tough. But with killer last-minute deals, all-in prices, views from your seat, and their lowest price guarantee, Game Time takes the guesswork out of buying MLB tickets. You can browse through the Game Time app and talk about upcoming opening day games and other high-profile events. That includes, any game that you want to go to. Like, no matter where you live, as long as you're somewhere near an MLB park, you're going to find a game that would be amazing to attend. There's last-minute deals, too. You can save up to 60% off buying last minute for sports, concerts, comedy, theater, and more. Also, flash deals. Save even more with exclusive in-app deals on select seats ahead of the game or the event. And, of course, Game Time always has the lowest price guarantee, or else Game Time will credit you 110% of the difference. Take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNBA for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and redeem the code LOCKEDONNBA. That's LOCKEDON NBA for $20 off. Download the Game Time app today. Last minute tickets, lowest price, guaranteed. All right, let's close today by talking Wolves-Rockets. We haven't seen Houston in a little while here. And, of course, since the Wolves last saw Houston, there was the Alperen Şengün injury. And at the time, when the Wolves last saw Houston, they knocked them down to 23-26. And Houston was basically left for dead. They ripped off 10 straight wins after the Şengün injury. So they were basically left for dead at the time. Then Şengün gets hurt, and it's like, okay, season's over. And then Houston rips off 10 straight. They just lost their last game to Dallas. They still are on the outside looking in the Western Conference. They're 2 games back of the Golden State Warriors with, I believe, Houston's got 10 games left, including this one against Minnesota. So they are fighting for their play-in lives, trying to catch Golden State. And this is a big game for them, obviously. And really, like, it's a bigger game for them, but a huge game for Minnesota, too, to get back on track after a disappointing loss to the Bulls on Sunday. These two teams, Wolves and Houston, have played twice this year. Minnesota's held Houston to under 100 points twice. They beat them back in early January, 122-95. Then they beat them 2 months ago, February 4th, 111-90. And again, both these games really dominant for Minnesota. And it's not a bad matchup for Minnesota at all. In the first game between these two teams, um, Jamichael Green. Jalen Green had 20 points on 7 of 16 for Houston. Overall, the Rockets shot the ball well, but the Wolves dominated the paint. They're much, much bigger than Houston, and they took advantage of that. They were plus 14. The Wolves were on the glass in this game. And that was the biggest thing. The Wolves also shot the ball really well from three, which combated Houston's. Houston shot 37%, made 12 threes. The Wolves were 42%, made 14 threes. They got 24 from Ant. They got 22, 8 and 6 from Karl-Anthony Towns in that game. The last time around in early February, Minnesota held Houston to just 33% from outside the arc and again dominated the glass, beating them by 17 on the boards in this game. Rudy and Cat both had double-doubles. Ant had 32, 6 and 5, and Nas had 13 and 6 off the bench. And the Wolves shot the ball well enough from outside the arc, but actually it was really kind of in the same realm as what Houston did. And that game was one, it was relatively close at halftime, but the Wolves used the third quarter to put away Houston. The first time around, the game was actually fairly close until the fourth quarter. The Wolves were up, I think, 10-12 go to the fourth quarter, but outscored them by 15 in the fourth to pull away. The matchup for Minnesota isn't bad. Houston's actually a team the Wolves match up with extremely well. And overall, Houston's kind of middle of the pack in pace. They're a pretty good defensive team, which can give the Wolves problems at times, but they're also middle of the pack in terms of turnover rate. They're not going to turn you over a ton, and they foul a lot too, which earlier in the year, that was a big deal for Minnesota. They were getting to the line all the time, as we talked about earlier in the show. The first matchup between these two teams, Minnesota shot 20 free throws. The second matchup, they shot 27 free throws. We haven't seen Minnesota get to the line with that frequency much at all lately. Remember, they're bottom 5 in the league since the Karl-Anthony Towns, or bottom 10 in the league since the Karl-Anthony Towns injury 12 games ago. So getting to the line is going to be really important in this game. Houston fouls a bunch. Minnesota has to be aggressive getting to the basket. They've got to force the issue. They have to be willing to run as well. They messed that up against the Bulls. The Bulls were a team that the Wolves should have been able to run against, but instead Minnesota turned it over so much that Chicago easily won the fast break category in that game. And as I talked about earlier, playing with pace is something I think is super important to the catless Timberwolves. And this is a game where I think they can do that. They can get out and run in transition. They can get to the free throw line. They're going to be okay in this game. In terms of Houston's offense, it's a pretty good offense overall. Like offensive rating wise, they're only 20th, but they've got some punch. They shoot a lot of threes. They actually get to the line a fair amount. They just don't have enough good shooters, period, right? Like their shot mix, their shot selection's good. They just don't have enough guys who can consistently knock down three-pointers as part of their rotation. And obviously missing Şengün, it hurts them less there. That's going to hurt them in the paint though, right? We talked already about how the Wolves dominated in the paint in the first two games, and now Şengün's not even available for them. So this is and also I should mention Tari Eason's out for the year too, which is a huge deal. I really like Tari Eason, so that's a big deal for them too. He didn't play, in either of the two games that the Wolves played them, but that's just to point out, like they've got some of this young talent here between Şengün and Tari Eason. Like Houston's coming, they've got a good coach in Ime Udoka, but for this particular matchup, it's a game that Minnesota shouldn't have a lot of problems with. They've got the size advantage, they've got the shooting advantage in terms of the actual shooting percentage as a team and as individuals on the team. The Wolves should be okay there. It's really going to be more of, can they get out in transition and force the issue? Can they get to the line a bunch? And, can they have the advantage in the paint, but can they really keep that advantage in the paint? They kind of sort of had it against Chicago, and Rudy had some good moments, but they allowed Chicago to hang around because the Wolves did not completely and utterly dominate the paint. And without having Karl-Anthony Towns, that's significant, obviously. But even still, between Rudy and Naz Reid and Ant getting into the lane and doing damage that way, this is a matchup that should have the Wolves coming out on top. The line over with our friends at FanDuel for this game for Friday night is Minnesota by 8 at home. They were 8.5-point favorites against Chicago on Sunday, which I thought was a little bit rich. And of course, they lost that game. This also feels a little bit high to me. I think the Wolves win, but I bet it's a 2-possession game. I'd be surprised if it's an 8-point win for Minnesota. I don't think they'll cover that -8 line, but I do think they'll win. So we'll see. And then, of course, this is the front end of a back-to-back for Minnesota. After the Timberwolves host Houston on Tuesday night, then they turn around and they host the Toronto Raptors on Wednesday night. Of course, we haven't seen Toronto since the very first game of the season, that debacle when the Wolves were held under 100 points. Both teams were under 100 points in the first game of the season way back in mid-October. So front end of a back-to-back, it's going to be tough. We'll do the post-game pod, of course, on Wednesday, and then we'll do a quick preview of Wolves-Rockets as well. Wolves-Raptors as well on Wednesday's show. Don't forget about the postcast. Should be live on Locked On Sports Minnesota on YouTube following Wolves-Rockets tonight. And then, of course, I'll have the post-game pod for you bright and early on Wednesday. So be sure that you check out both of those shows here in the next, 24 hours-ish from now. That's all we have for today here on the show. A big thank you for making Locked On Wolves your first listen every single day. Of course, this show is free and available everywhere, wherever you like to listen to podcasts. You can also watch on the Locked On Sports Minnesota app on both Roku and Amazon Fire TV. You can also follow on Twitter at Locked On T-Wolves and also at Beecken with 2 B's, 2 E's, C-K-E-N. A reminder about the Locked On, the first ever national sports 24/7 streaming channel launched by Locked On YouTube, and it's also available on Amazon Fire TV and the free Fire TV channels app. Locked On Sports Today is here for you 24/7, covering the top sports stories of the day with the local experts of Locked On, plus our national shows covering every league. Find Locked On Sports Today now available on the free Fire TV channels app. All right, that's all we have for you today. A reminder, Locked On Wolves is part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Remember, the Locked On Network is your local experts at all the biggest stories. Once again, I'm Ben Beecken. This is the Locked On Wolves podcast, and we'll catch you next time.